How did a piece of rope manage to change the course of the economy? Many things changed in human history: weapons, fire, land. But there is one question. Where does a piece of rope stand among all of these? Before rope existed, what could people not carry? What could they not tie? What could they not store and say, I will use this later? When the rope first appeared, humans did not merely produce an object. They invented a new way of relating to time. Because the rope did not just tie something, it carried it into the future. It created a distinction between what is held and what is kept. Hunting ceased to be merely hunting and turned into the concept of reserve. Carrying was no longer an obligation, but a choice, and this choice created a silent yet irreversible rupture in human behavior. With the rope, humans could, for the first time, say, not now, later. And this phrase was the earliest sentence of economic thinking. At this point, the issue was not physical strength, but mental distance. Things that could be carried by hand were consumed immediately, but things that were tied, collected, hung, and protected through the rope became part of a plan. Humans began to manage scarcity rather than abundance. Because if you tie and keep something, you accept that tomorrow may be different from today. This acceptance is the fundamental psychological condition of economic behavior. The rope silently transformed the concept of ownership. Land had not yet been measured, borders had not been drawn, but something that was tied already meant mine. Whoever tied it, whoever kept it, whoever protected it, ownership was considered to belong to them. This did not function through law, but through practical memory. The rope was not a legal document, but it was a sufficiently clear sign for collective memory. If something was tied, someone had set it aside for the future, and this separation was respected. Over time, the rope began to be used not only for storage, but also for measurement. Concepts of length, distance, and equality emerged. Equal length of rope meant equal share. This was the silent beginning of exchange. People began to think not only about their needs, but also about their shares. And the concept of shares made discussions of equality and justice inevitable. When the question of who should receive how much could be measured through the rope, stability within society became possible. The rope also changed the relationship with security. What was stored had to be protected, and what was protected required guarding. This gave rise to the concept of shifts, watchmen, and division of responsibility. If something did not belong to everyone, protecting it was not everyone's job. Thus, the division of labor began to form not only according to skills, but also according to relationships with property. Those who stored, those who protected. Those who tied began to occupy different positions within society. At this point, the rope was no longer a simple tool. It became an invisible rule that regulated behavior. By looking at the rope, people could distinguish who was planning, who was thinking about tomorrow, and who was living only for today. This distinction gave birth to the earliest forms of social hierarchy. Those who stored more, planned more, and tied more began to be seen as more reliable, more intelligent, and more valuable. The rope also laid the psychological foundation of trade. Because a person who tied and stored something was not forced to exchange it immediately, there was the option to wait, and waiting creates the concept of price. If you can wait, it means you are not in a hurry, and if you are not in a hurry, the other party is forced to consider your terms. Thus, the rope became the silent tool of bargaining power. Power was no longer in muscles, but in reserves. Over time, this behavioral model was passed down from generation to generation. The rope could change technically, its material could differ, but the mental model it created remained stable. Store, measure, tie, wait, and then exchange. This sequence became the architecture of economic thinking. Without realizing it, people began to make their daily decisions according to this sequence, and societies grew upon this model. Today, no matter how complex digital systems, contracts, and markets may appear, at their core, the same question remains. Who stores what? How much do they store? And how long can they wait? The rope is no longer visible, but its logic is everywhere. Concepts such as credit, reserves, deposits, and collateral are all modern forms of this ancient behavior. The tool has changed, but the human relationship with time has remained the same. And here two questions arise that are worth thinking about. If you were the first person to tie and store something, what would you sacrifice to protect it? And where would that choice place you within society? And if a society values those who store and those who consume immediately equally, could that society remain stable for a long time? The answers to these questions are shaped by your thinking. Share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel to continuously watch this type of content and think about these topics together. Your perspective is part of this flow. As the rope entered daily life, humans began to change their relationship not with objects, but with probabilities. Because not everything had to be used immediately anymore. Every storable object promised a different future outcome. This promise extended the cause-effect chain in the human brain, turning decisions from instant reflexes into sequential thinking. In this sense, the rope was not a material technology, but the first technology to create mental distance. This mental distance introduced humans to the concept of risk. Previously, risk was whether the hunt would be successful or not. With the rope, risk turned into the probability of stored things being stolen, decaying, or lost. Risk was no longer momentary, but a probability spread over time. This brought calculation along with fear. Humans began to ask for the first time, how much should I store? As storage increased, comparison began. The question of who had how much reserve replaced the question of who was stronger. Physical strength was still important, but it was no longer the only measure, because a person who stored could survive even when strength failed. This created a new form of prestige within society. Quiet, planned, and patient people began to come to the forefront. The concept of reserves created through the rope also changed sharing. Previously, after the hunt, the share was divided immediately. Now, whether the share should be stored or not became a subject of discussion. This discussion was one of the first economic disputes. The question of who should receive now and who should receive later tested the concept of equality. Here, the rope became not a simple tool, but the center of social tension. This tension required rules, and rules meant agreement. The agreement was not written, but reinforced through behavior. Whoever did not respect the reserve tied with the rope was considered untrustworthy by society, and the loss of trust produced consequences heavier than physical punishment. Thus, the rope became the silent unit of measurement of ethical behavior. Over time, this trust mechanism expanded. The rope began to be used not only for personal reserves, but also for collective resources. Warehouses and communal storage spaces formed. These places were critical for the future of the society. Damaging them meant putting the entire group at risk. This understanding strengthened the idea of collective responsibility. Collective responsibility, in turn, created the need for governance. Questions such as who stores how much and who takes when required answers. Those who provided these answers gradually rose to leadership positions. Leadership was no longer measured solely by combat skills, but by the management of reserves. At this point, the rope became one of the main tools of political power. This form of management laid the foundation of trade. Groups could now exchange not only surplus, but also stored goods. Stored goods were more valuable because they carried time and patience within them. Every object loaded with time demanded a higher return. This is the psychological root of price. When price emerged, debt became inevitable because not everyone had the ability to store at the same time. Borrowing was a line stretching from future reserves to present needs. This line, though invisible like the rope, bound both sides. The borrower put up their future, while the lender put up their patience. This relationship was asymmetric. The lender could wait, the borrower was impatient. Impatience was perceived as weakness. Thus, the reserve culture that began with the rope deepened social hierarchy. Those who could wait held superior positions. Those who could not wait became dependent. Dependence was not only material, its psychological impact was deeper. The indebted person changed their behavior, avoided risk, and tried to adapt to the system. Because a wrong move meant losing reserves. Here, the rope became an invisible instrument of discipline. Behavior was guided without physical violence. Over time, This discipline model became normalized. People began to see those with reserves as intelligent and those without as irresponsible. This labeling functioned regardless of individual character. The rope became a filter that silently determined who was good and who was bad. Social value overlapped with material behavior. At this point, the rope was no longer a technology, but a culture. Children learned to store. Adults shared cautiously. Even tales, myths, and stories praised this behavior. The one who stored became the hero, and the one who wasted was punished. Rope logic embedded itself into cultural memory. As cultural memory deepened, the system hardened. Those who did not follow the rules were excluded. This exclusion was not physical, but economic. Cutting off access to reserves isolated a person from society. Thus, the storage culture that began with the rope turned into a mechanism of social control. This mechanism laid the foundation for more complex structures. Warehouses grew, protection intensified, measurement units became precise. Each step was the development of rope logic: tie, measure, store, weight. When this sequence was disrupted, the system was shaken. Therefore, it was protected. This protection was not instinctive, but learned. People unconsciously aligned their behavior with this sequence. Decisions were made not only for today, but for tomorrow. Every decision made for tomorrow made people more predictable. Predictable people were safe for the system. Thus, the rope did not only change economic flow, but also change the human relationship with the self. Humans began to manage their future for the first time through objects. This management appeared as freedom, but it was also responsibility. Storage gave freedom, but it demanded rules. Over time, this rule became an unwritten law. Those who store are respected. Those who do not are considered risky. This simple formula remained unchanged for millennia. Tools changed, materials changed, but rope logic continued, because it touched the deep layers of human behavior. The rope tied humans to the future, and humans tied to the future no longer acted only on instinct. They thought, calculated, and compared. Economic movement began precisely at this moment, not with a piece of rope, but with the time consciousness it created. As rope logic became digitized, its physical presence disappeared, but its economic function became even stronger, because tying, separating, and transferring are now carried out not through material fiber, but through contracts, code, and protocols. Humanity did not let go of the rope. It merely made it invisible, and this invisibility allowed power to operate in a more centralized manner. In the digital world, the concept of tying was reborn through data storage and transmission, because data is also accumulated, protected, and used for the future like a product. Servers, networks, and algorithms now perform the work once done by the rope, but the core reflex does not change. Value can only be planned when it can be stored, and everything that is planned turns into economic power. This transformation is especially clear in the financial system, because concepts such as credit, risk, and trust are now based more on binding behavior than on physical collateral. In the past, the rope stabilized loads. Today, systems stabilize human behavior and place future actions on a predictable trajectory. What is bound here is no longer a load, but probability. As binding probability becomes the main objective of finance, economic relationships become more abstract, yet equally rigid. When a rope broke, the load fell. But when digital bonds break, a person falls out of the system. This difference explains why modern economic risk has such deep psychological impact. This psychological impact is not accidental, because what is stored and transmitted is no longer only resources, but behavioral history. Just as the rope stored memory in knots, modern systems turn past actions into memory, and this memory defines the boundaries of the future. Thus, the economic timeline is shaped independently of individual will. At this point, tension arises between planning and freedom, because everything planned is built upon pre-bound probabilities. People believe they are planning, but in reality, they are moving within bound systems. The sense of security created by the rope now turns into invisible rules that silently guide behavior. Looking at history, we see that this mechanism is not unfamiliar. because every major economic leap began with a simple tool changing how we think. Inventions, such as the rope, the wheel, and writing, may appear material, but their main effect was on how humans imagined the future. Anything that changes the imagination of the future also changes the market. This imagination that changed the market turned trade into not just exchange, but a systematic process. And within this process, trust became a measurable resource. When trust becomes measurable, it can be managed. And when it is managed, it becomes centralized. The path that began with the simplicity of the rope laid the psychological foundation of today's complex financial architecture. Systems built on this foundation claim to give individuals freedom of choice, but in reality, they predefine the boundaries of choices. Bound resources create bound opportunities, and people can only see the consequences of their actions to the extent allowed by the system. This is the silent paradox of the modern economic order. The paradox is that as security increases, dependency also increases, because everything that is stored and protected requires central control. The rope protected the community, but it also subjected it to certain rules. These rules gradually turned into law and then into norms, and economic behavior formed around these norms. As norms formed, economic morality also changed, because the ability to bind properly became a measure of honesty. In the past, one who tied a proper knot was considered trustworthy. Today, those who act in accordance with system rules are considered trustworthy. When trust is measured by technical compliance, moral nuance recedes into the background. This retreat changes the economic identity of humans, because identity is now defined not by intention, but by recorded behavior. The memory of the rope now lives in digital traces, and as long as these traces are not erased, the past continuously determines the present. Time ceases to be linear and turns into a circular control mechanism. Within this circle, economic history is not only about understanding the past, but about seeing why present behavior feels so constrained. The rope shows us that the greatest changes occur with the quietest tools. Loud inventions attract attention, but those that change systems are usually invisible. These invisible changes place humans in a strange position in the modern world, because even though they feel free, every step they take is on pre-bound structures. When a rope broke, the load fell. But now, when bonds break, the person remains suspended in emptiness. This is a rare situation where security and risk increase simultaneously. At this point, looking back becomes inevitable, because the chain created by the simple tool at the beginning still continues today. The rope shows us that economic power is born not only from big ideas, but from small technical possibilities. The ability to store comes before the ability to exchange, and history has proven this repeatedly. The conclusion drawn from this is clear, but not comforting, because no matter how complex modern financial and trade systems appear, the core reflex is still built on binding, storing, and control. The rope changed, the form changed, but the mechanism directing human behavior remained the same. Now, within this general theme, two questions remain, whose answers may differ for everyone, and it is precisely these differences that set thought in motion. If the rope had not existed, and humans had learned to store resources later, could today's concepts of trade and property have formed in the same way, or would economic history have taken an entirely different path? And the second question is more disturbing. When we replaced the physical rope with digital bonds in the modern world, did we gain security, or did we simply make control more invisible? How you see this question and which side you find more convincing is the real continuation of this topic, and sharing it in the comments keeps the discussion alive. If you want to see more of these kinds of inventions that seem absurd, remain hidden in financial history, yet quietly change the world, you can become part of this flow by subscribing to the channel. Which simple object or technical detail in history do you think most interestingly changed the course of economic development? And why does it provoke thought for you in particular? Do not hesitate to write this in the comments as well.